Let's cut through the crowd. Tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent. Let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George. Well, she just can't stay away, or I wouldn't want to keep her away. It's Laura Bellin is coming back on Podcast by George, and it's just because of the news of the day coming out of the state of Iowa, and particularly the governor's office. And it's just jaw-dropping. I just find it shocking, regardless of whether or not you're in Iowa or an Iowan, if anywhere in the world, really, if you're looking at these stories that are coming out of the governor's office here in Iowa, it deserves coverage, and Laura Bellin is all over it. Let's welcome her back into a podcast by George. Hi, Laura.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, George.
Well, I wanted to get to this right off the top. This is a story that you've been on here in the past week or so, and it's about Governor Kim Reynolds revealing that on April 29th, she is sending back $95 million in federal funds designated for testing students for COVID-19. She kind of made that announcement in a back-slapping event at Fox News, an event featuring Republican governors down in Orlando. I'm going to show that here very quickly with any success, and we'll come right back.
And I said in the condition of the state, not only are we going to give parents 100% option for online learning, but we're going to give parents 100% option to have their child in the classroom 5 days a week. And every school district in the state of Iowa is going to adhere to that. We have kids in the classroom. They're learning. We're playing sports. They're doing it safely and responsibly. And it's going to make a difference.
That's our Governor Kim Reynolds. Now, that's a slightly different clip. It's from a different portion of the presentation, but she's talking about what a wonderful job that we did here in the state of Iowa. And Laura reported on this, too, and some of the initial reaction was very good coming from Rob Sand, Laura.
Well, the funny thing was I wasn't watching the town hall on Thursday night, but my Twitter feed exploded with people saying the governor sent $95 million back to the federal government for testing in schools. And honestly, I thought that it was some kind of a fake rumor that was spreading on Twitter. And I was asking, where are you hearing this? And they said, she just said it on TV. And then somebody posted the clip where she said that the Biden administration wanted to give them $95 million to test kids in schools. And she said, our kids have been back in school safely since August. And so I told them, you can have your $95 million back. And it really is jaw-dropping, like you said, because as far as I can determine from asking the Iowa Department of Public Health and the Iowa Department of Education, school districts were not asked, hey, could you use some money to do routine testing in schools? The state just determined that they didn't want this money. They didn't want to set up a system for routinely testing kids. And by the way, this could have been used for summer activities as well. It could have been used under the CDC guidance for next fall in the academic year. It could have been used to help local lab resources and infrastructure and IT services to support this kind of testing program. There were 14 different ways the CDC said states could use this pot of money, which is part of the American Rescue Plan, the last COVID-19 relief package that Congress passed. And Iowa just turned it back. And you just wonder what on earth they're thinking. Why wouldn't you want to have extra money available to test kids? We know, especially teenagers, we know they do spread this virus. And we think we know from the variants that are circulating, especially the B117 variant, that's the one that was first identified in the UK, that one does seem to be transmitted more easily among kids. So you would think that we would want to know more about how the virus is spreading, but the governor would prefer not to have any information. And right now, no school district in Iowa has a routine surveillance testing program. Kids who are sick, their families are referred to local places where they can get tested, but there's nothing that's systematically testing all the kids in a student body just to see where we are and how many asymptomatic spreaders there may be.
I read your reporting. I looked at this video. My initial reaction was just being an average guy looking at this going, you did what? You took almost $100 million that was earmarked that could be used here in the state of Iowa, and then you sent it back to the federal government. Who does that? And the second reaction that I had was, again, based on your reporting earlier this year, the governor apparently has been very creative in finding ways to use federal money within the state of Iowa in the past, skirting some guidelines perhaps to get it done.
Right. Well, I mean, she used $500,000 so far to pay the permanent salaries of members of her staff. So that is a questionable thing. But just to give people an idea of how much $95 million is for testing, the Test Iowa program, which is the public-private partnership that was set up under a no-bid contract last April, that was a 6-month contract for 540,000 tests. So it was supposed to cover 3,000 tests a day for 6 months with a lot of supporting infrastructure associated with that. That was a $26 million contract. So think about, again, how many tests $95 million could pay for. And right now we have more inexpensive testing options available, like antigen tests. Those are the ones that give the rapid results within 15 to 30 minutes. That would be ideal for a regular weekly or biweekly basis testing in schools. But again, the state of Iowa wasn't interested. And I was told by the Department of Education spokesperson, well, we haven't had any school districts ask for money for testing. I said, well, did you tell any of them that the money was available? Because of course they're not going to randomly write to the state and say, please give us money to weekly test every student. But if they didn't know that the CDC suddenly had this large pot of money, and somebody else pointed out that the governor has been complaining about this, what she calls a blue state bailout, this COVID-19 relief package, and that Iowa taxpayers shouldn't be supporting, the blue state bailout. Well, now she's sending this $95 million back to the federal government. So where's it going to go? It's going to go to other states. Money that's supported by all American taxpayers. I mean, this $95 million represents Iowa's share of a $10 billion bucket that was specifically for helping schools reopen and operate safely. And Iowa just said no to that. And it's inexplicable, really.
And it's maybe even more ironic or insulting, the fact that if you hear Republicans talk about anything, really, and I don't want to pick too much on Republicans. I'll talk about that in a little bit also. But the mantra is always jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, you had an epidemiologist, I think, on Bleeding Heartland that was talking about this money could be creating jobs in the state of Iowa for this testing,
yes.
Correct?
Yes. And also State Auditor Rob Sands said the same thing. Like you could have there could be a lot of jobs created and people set up regularly, either conducting the testing or being couriers to bring the tests to the various labs that are going to process them. I mean, absolutely. I mean, just generally speaking, why would we turn down this amount of money? It's a very significant amount of money for Iowa schools. I mean, it's not $95 million is really a lot. The whole state budget is about between 7 and 8 billion. I mean, so this is a significant chunk.
Well, I'll tell you what I think. I mean, I think it's all political grandstanding. I think it's all one party versus another. She's on Fox News. She goes down to Orlando to participate in this thing. It's a bunch of finger pointing at Biden. It's a bunch of self-promotion. I don't know if any taxpayer funds are used for that kind of thing. But, these media outlets and this type of behavior, folks, I mean, it may not get us all killed, but it's sure as hell harming all of us. And I think this is a quintessential example of that. Why would you turn this money around? Why would you, for political grandstanding? That's the explanation that I'm coming up with. So
I think so. I mean, I think it's clear that if the Trump administration had arranged for this kind of level of funding for states, that the governor would not be sending it back. As for who paid for the trip, by the way, I'll be looking into that later. Generally speaking, when the governor goes to events like this, her campaign pays for it. And in many cases, a donor will donate the use of a private plane for her to fly down to some political event. And so I anticipate that that's what I'm going to find when her next campaign finance disclosure is filed. There will probably be some money spent. I doubt that state funds were spent to fly her down to this governor's town hall event on Fox News. I would imagine that was a campaign expense.
You wouldn't think that they would be that dumb. But we'll wait and see, I guess. To me, it's just fanning the flames. I mean, I'm just Iowa Podcast by George. I look at that and condemn her for doing that type of thing. I would do the same thing on the left side of the spectrum as far as going down and doing that for strictly political reasons, if it were MSNBC or on CNN. I've talked about that on the podcast before. I don't want to digress too much, but I was a Tulsi Gabbard fan here in the last election run-up. She's going on Fox right now because they won't give her a platform on MSNBC. But what she's doing is completely different. She's not going on there and pointing fingers at the Democrats and, lambasting Biden and all that. That's not the point of what she's doing. She's going on there to appeal to the sensibilities, if they have any, of Fox viewers, and particularly their conservative religious fundamentalism as Christians, to start to do and think about the right things. I don't know if that's going to work. I know that it did work with that nut job Tucker Carlson on Fox and Jimmy Dore. He went on and talked to him about Julian Assange, and Carlson said right on air that Jimmy Dore changed his opinion about Julian Assange. So it can work if you approach it correctly, but just going on one side of the spectrum and hating on the other side is going to hate us all into the ground. But that's my rant for this podcast, I suppose.
And I didn't get into this in my post about rejecting this funding, but I do think that this counteracts. The governor has been out there in recent weeks encouraging Iowans to get vaccinated for COVID and saying we really need more people to get vaccinated. Well, when she goes on Fox News and basically says the pandemic's over, I mean, that our kids have been in school safely. Yeah. We don't need to do any testing in schools. We know our kids are safe in schools. What she's telling people is that they should just go and do their normal life and everything is fine. And of course, most kids are not eligible to be vaccinated yet because they haven't lowered the age. But if we're really concerned about reducing community spread, we don't need to be sending the message that basically the pandemic is over and it's just the Biden administration and Democrats who want you to think that this is still a big deal. And so I feel that she's really hurting, I mean, not just herself, but she's hurting her own constituents, because we're seeing the vaccine refusal rates, particularly in the most Republican counties, and it's worrying a lot of experts that we might not get to that herd immunity level, I mean, ever, or certainly we won't get there as soon as we could have.
All right, well, that's Laura, and I want to make sure people understand this is my opinion. The other thing I do, I look at that video, and I mean, this is a cynic in me, obviously, but I look at our governor, and I look at that beautiful coiffed hair and the outfit and the dental work and all of that, and I look at that and I see affluence, I see money, and if I'm somebody whose kids are going to school and they're having to get free lunches and breakfast, and I can't afford braces and for the kids, and all, I mean, that's an insult to injury to me personally. But again, that's just me personally. Yeah. Let's go to a second story here. More insult to injury here. This is something that you and I talked about months ago, some excellent original reporting that you had regarding these strike forces when it comes to the testing for COVID-19 COVID-19 here in the state of Iowa. And, I have a tendency to call this type of thing maybe Iowa-nice corruption. It's cronyism, it's favoritism. I don't know what label you put on it, but it doesn't look right to me, Laura.
It sure looked corrupt to me. And I was really unhappy. As you mentioned, we talked about this a few months ago because I was investigating the use of strike teams that involved Iowa Department of Public Health personnel and Iowa National Guard personnel. They sent these out to various workplaces and counties to test long-term care employees. But really, the original purpose was to go to places like these large meatpacking plants and just test everybody and identify so that we could isolate the people who were positive. And so it was a worthwhile program, but I had asked for information months ago about every single strike team event, and I got a redacted list. Some of the companies' names were not posted, but they showed me 10 strike team visits to workplaces owned by 9 companies. And some of those, they named the companies. Some of those I was able to piece together, and a few I couldn't piece together. But they told me that program ended on June 5th of 2020. And then a few days after I had published about the governor greenlighting a strike team to be sent to a company linked to her major donor, Bruce Rastetter, the Associated Press reported that there was also the state arranged to have COVID testing done at Iowa Select Farms. This is a large hog producer, but the testing that was done last July was at their administrative headquarters. So it wasn't like on a big meatpacking factory floor where people are working in close quarters. It was a white collar office. And so I immediately started asking questions. Hey, what was this team that was sent to test Iowa Select Farms? This is a company where the owners have given $300,000 to the governor's campaigns. Did this involve the Iowa National Guard? Do you have any revisions to your list of strike teams? And it took 12 weeks to get the information out of the Iowa Department of Public Health. And they finally revealed that, yes, that July visit to Iowa Select Farms was a strike team, and there were 6 other strike teams that they hadn't previously disclosed. And at least a couple of those went to companies that are linked to major donors to the governor. And I really question whether they ever would have admitted that if the Associated Press hadn't first uncovered the information. And also, State Auditor Rob Sand's office is looking into the strike team program. And I think that the state might have wanted to get ahead of whatever investigation he's going to publish at some point. But I was really unhappy. I mean, I submitted an unambiguous request for all of the instances where the Iowa National Guard was deployed to help corporations with testing, and they just left some off the list. And I don't think it was an accident that some of those they omitted to tell me about were related to very politically well-connected companies. And I really question the utility of sending out a strike team to anybody's administrative headquarters. I mean, there were plenty of resources available for that company to have their 33 people at their headquarters tested last July.
Well, the other eye-opener was, if I was reading it correctly, is not only who they gave it to and the possible connection to donors and that type of thing, but they tried to play it off as, well, everybody got assistance that asked for it. But that's not necessarily true, correct?
Well, that was what the governor said in January when this story came out about Iowa Select Farms. She said, over 60 companies asked for help and we didn't tell anybody no. So I asked them, I said, okay, give me the information, names of companies, who got test supplies sent, who got a strike team sent or other kind of assistance. Because I knew from my previous reporting, I had reached out to some firms like TPI Composites. They make those big wind turbines in Newton. They've got like 1,000 employees. Yeah. So they had received test supplies. They had a big outbreak, and one of their employees died, unfortunately, last May. But in April, they had a big outbreak, and they got test supplies from the state. And they had Mercy One nurses administer the test. So I was looking for examples of which companies just got the supplies and which got like the full concierge treatment of the strike teams. And that was something that I just had to keep asking and asking for. And then earlier last month, the Iowa Department of Public Health sent me a list that just had company names and dates, but it didn't indicate who got what kind of help. So finally, last Monday, they did send me a list that differentiated between strike teams, test supplies only, and then some companies, about 20 companies, got a Test Iowa link. That means that there was a Test Iowa site, that's that public-private partnership nearby, and they were given certain hours where their employees could go and get tested. And I mean, it's fine, and it might have been adequate, but there were some large meatpacking plants that were just given a Test Iowa link, and that makes me wonder, did all of their employees actually get over there? Were they able to get transportation to get there? Were they able to get past any language barriers and scheduling an appointment through Test Iowa? I mean, I think if you're going to send these strike teams anywhere, send them to the big meatpacking plants, because we know last April and May, that's where the biggest outbreaks in the country were, and the biggest outbreaks in the state of Iowa. So for instance, I mean, one of the newly disclosed strike team visits was for the Prestige pork plant, which is in Wright County, Eagle Grove, Iowa. And yes, I mean, the owners of that plant are also donors to the governor's campaign. But I don't think that's an illegitimate use of a strike team. I mean, you've got to send it there. It's a large facility where people from several counties around work there. So you don't want to have an outbreak at a place like that. And that's very different from what happened last May when the governor approved the strike team going to Bruce Rastetter's company, which isn't part of the food system. They only have a couple hundred employees. They only had one confirmed case. I mean, that's an example where they could have just been sent test supplies. I mean, you didn't need to send out the National Guard. So that's one of the questions I've been trying to answer. And I assume that the state auditor will be able to get it answered better than I can because he has subpoena power. But what were the criteria? I mean, because it wasn't based on how many cases they had in the workforce. It wasn't based on what kind of community spread there was in the county, but who determined which firms got this strike team treatment. And that's where I think what you described as Iowa nice corruption might have come into play.
Well, and we're running out of time here. You can reel me back in, but I look at this as maybe the overarching issue that we're going to be hearing a lot about here in Iowa and in this country for the next several years, and that is there's not enough money. now that the Republicans have lost control of their agenda nationally, they're going to be telling us that we can't fund any of these things that we need, that lower income Americans particularly need, because there's no money for it. They got theirs. And the same is true here in the state of Iowa. And I'm sure that you're aware of any number of legislative priorities that are going to be squandered here in the state of Iowa because we're going to be told there's no money for it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think that'll be a story of the next few years.
That's sad. That's too bad. But
maybe
this
there's a lot of money, a lot of federal COVID relief money still to be spent, and I'll be trying to keep an eye on where it's going. And unfortunately, the Iowa legislature's oversight committees are just not interested in looking at anything related to this. They don't want to look at how the governor spent the money. They rejected the Democrats' calls to have oversight hearings on rejecting this $95 million for testing. So we have one branch of government in Iowa that has just abdicated because there happens to be a Republican in the governor's office, and they don't want to question any of her decisions.
Well, Laura, the name of my autobiography yet to be written is funny how that works. So we'll see. Well, I'll give you a last word here because we're out of time. Yeah, close up shop for us. Give us put a ribbon on this one for us.
Well, as I said, I think that there is more to be learned, but I am looking forward to reading the state auditor's report at some point when it comes out on this use of the strike teams and the Iowa National Guard, because that's a big, to deploy the National Guard to help out some companies and to have no consistent criteria in how that happened. That should be a huge scandal. And I think that we have more to learn. I've tried to learn what I can, but I think there's a lot more to learn on that.
I just want to read this one line when it comes to the strike force thing. The paragraph here says, and this is from Bleeding Heartland, folks, the governor's spokesperson, Pat Garrett, did not respond to any of Bleeding Heartland's emails on this subject. Reynolds walked away when I, Laura Bellin, tried to ask her about the strike team decisions at a media gaggle on April 28th. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier in this republicanism in America. They would portend to be really tough. They want people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, their fellow Americans. They're the party of John Wayne and that type of thing, and they run literally from Laura Bellin. Now, Laura, I've had you on the show lots of times. You're great, but I'm not afraid of you necessarily. The governor won't allow you in her news conferences. She walks away from you when you try to question her at these gaggles. What do you make of that? Is that fear, or what is that all about?
Well, I think, clearly they just didn't want to answer questions about that, but she usually doesn't have a gaggle like that in a public place. This was in the rotunda at the state capitol, and that's why I thought I might be able to get a question in. But next time I'll just have to shout out my question earlier in the event. I was trying to let the other reporters ask about the main topics of the day, which were the broadband bill she just signed and what was going on with the vaccines. And then I tried to jump in and ask my question, and her press guy declared an end to the press conference, and she just walked away. So, it's an ongoing saga. But they did tell, her spokesperson did respond to Ryan Foley of the Associated Press, who reported on this story last week and said that politics never entered into this. This was all based on the needs of the companies. But what needs? That's one of my questions, because it wasn't based on how many cases they had in their workforce. And it wasn't based, clearly Iowa Select Farms had many other ways to arrange for 33 employees to get tested last July. Testing supplies were not so scarce in July as they had been in April and May. And as some of the earlier decisions, I really do question. Like I said, TPI Composites, they had a lot of cases leading to at least one death in their workforce, and they were just sent the test supplies, whereas Lynch Livestock, which is way up in Northeast Iowa, Howard County, and owned by someone who's given $100,000 to the governor's campaigns, they got a strike team. Why did that happen?
Well, the answer will be in Bleeding Heartland. When Laura gets it, you'll see it there. I'm going to put the URL, the web address, up on the page here. And again, I want to encourage everybody to go to bleedingheartland.com, follow Laura's writings and the other contributors that are on there. Outstanding, excellent stuff, because it's a community blog, Bleeding Heartland, and you'll find articles like this virtually every day. And of course, you can contribute. You can be a patron of theirs on Patreon and support this kind of work. World Press Day was just Monday, I think. So that's a great time to remind everybody. Laura, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Thanks, George. Always a pleasure.
Folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for this particular episode. If you like Podcast by George, I would encourage you to do something very similar. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and choose the platform. It's all free that you would like to follow us on. It's on YouTube, Facebook, iTunes, any place that podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to wrap this one up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.